The Ross estate had always stood like a kingdom. White columns, cold iron gates that seemed to inhale wealth, and impossibly manicured lawns that hid the rot beneath the surface. It was a masterpiece of architectural deceit, promising permanence while harboring decay. To the city, it was a symbol of old money, untouchable prestige, and the kind of generational success that required neither effort nor ethics. But to Evelyn Ross, who had grown up within its gilded cage, it was a beautiful, echoing prison where every transaction was emotional and every gesture was a calculation. Her father, Arthur Ross, was the architect of this kingdom, a self-made tycoon who had parlayed a single, shrewd investment into Ross Holdings, a global real estate and development empire. Arthur believed in building, in material dominance, but he held a fierce, secret belief in integrity that his family willfully ignored. Her mother, Margaret Ross, was the perfect hostess. She was sculpted, elegant, and perfectly silent, a living, breathing piece of expensive furniture that ratified her husband's power. Margaret was the embodiment of complicity, choosing the comfort of status over the discomfort of truth. And then there was Daniel, Evelyn's older brother by 2 years. He was the heir apparent, groomed for ruthlessness from birth, charming in a predatory way, brilliant in mathematics and cold strategy, and utterly, proudly ruthless. Daniel didn't just inherit the company. He consumed the values that created it, leaving behind only the hunger. The Ross family believed in legacy. They spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones, a multi-generational endowment of power. But legacies, Evelyn had learned long before the fall, weren't inherited, they were stolen, one small piece of humanity at a time. Evelyn, the younger sibling, was the anomaly. She preferred dusty libraries to glittering ballrooms, and volunteer work abroad to family mergers. This difference, this quiet rebellion, was the crack that Daniel eventually prized open. While Daniel saw the company as a machine for personal gain, Evelyn saw the vast potential for the good Arthur had sometimes, and only sometimes, alluded to. The morning of her father's death was gray and heavy with mist, fitting the oppressive silence that had settled over the estate weeks earlier, when Arthur had quietly, almost secretly, suffered his first major cardiac event. Evelyn had been away, deep in the Amazonian basin, volunteering in a small, underfunded orphanage, a desperate, idealistic attempt to step out of her father's towering, gold-plated shadow. She knew the work would disappoint Daniel. She hoped it would make her father proud. When she finally got the call, a curt, emotionless message from Daniel's personal assistant, she didn't cry. The shock was a cold, paralyzing weight. She drove 6 hours straight through the churning morning, the old pickup truck vibrating beneath her, a world away from the luxury cars she should have been driving. She found Daniel standing in the massive, mahogany-framed doorway of the estate, already looking like the sole proprietor of the grief. His arms were crossed over his designer coat, his face a chilling mask of unreadable control. "You're late," he said, his voice flat, devoid of sympathy. It was an accusation, not a greeting. Evelyn's 6 hours of choked-back emotion finally cracked her voice. "I came as soon as I received the message. The jungle doesn't get reception." "He's gone," Daniel interrupted, his eyes flickering with a kind of dark satisfaction she couldn't name. "You missed the last goodbye. The legal matters have been handled." The words sliced deep. Legal matters. The coldness of his immediate shift to administration was a physical blow. She swallowed the pain and the insult, focusing on the house. The heavy, soundproof door to her father's private study, the inner sanctum where the real decisions were made, was locked. Daniel's doing. "Why can't I see him, Daniel?" she demanded, a desperate urgency in her tone. "The body is still here, isn't it? I need to say goodbye." He smiled faintly, a brief, sharp flash of the killer she would eventually know him to be. "Because there are things you wouldn't understand, Evie, things that are above your pay grade." That was how it had always been. He decided the rules of the kingdom. She, the emotional and slightly rebellious younger sister, obeyed or was dismissed. This time, she was dismissed entirely. She was given a guest room and told to remain quiet until the funeral. The air in the house was thick with unspoken transactions and the new weight of Daniel's undisputed authority. A week later, the family gathered in the oak-paneled study for the reading of Arthur Ross's last will and testament. The room smelled faintly of old leather and new fear. Evelyn sat beside her mother on a heavy antique sofa. Margaret was composed, her face a pale blank canvas, her hand gripping a handkerchief so tightly her knuckles were white. Evelyn's own hands were trembling, not from grief, but from a growing, icy premonition. The family lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a man whose eyes avoided Evelyn's and whose demeanor was unusually anxious, cleared his throat with a dry sound that seemed too loud in the silent room. "We are gathered to hear the final wishes of Arthur Ross," Thompson began, unfolding a thick parchment sealed with a fresh wax stamp. He read through the formalities until he reached the distribution of assets. "To my son, Daniel Ross, I leave the entirety of Ross Holdings, effective immediately, as well as the primary estate and all associated tangible assets. He is deemed the sole successor in the ongoing management of the empire." Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel, sitting across the room, didn't even look at her. He merely adjusted his tie. Thompson continued, his voice monotone, rushing through the next section. "To my daughter, Evelyn Ross, I leave the smaller, non-income generating property in Glenmere and a trust fund of $2 million, which will become accessible upon her 30th birthday." Silence settled over the room like burial soil. Evelyn's head snapped up, the color returning in a hot rush of indignation. "What? That can't be right," Father said. "He promised me the foundation. He said we would run it together. This is a fraction." Daniel's smirk was razor thin, a victory carved into his face. Father changed his mind, Evie. You left, remember? You chose orphans and buses over the business. I stayed. I put in the work. This is the reward for loyalty. Evelyn turned to her mother, searching for an ally, a truth-teller. Margaret's eyes avoided hers, fixed on the pattern of the Persian rug. The silence was louder than, "Mother, did you know about this?" Evelyn pleaded. Margaret finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Your father was very disappointed in your choices, Evelyn. He made it clear. But Evelyn knew her father, the man who taught her to build, not to bow, who saw her idealism as a strength, not a weakness. He would never have erased her. The will bore his signature, but the ink looked fresh, too fresh. Arthur Ross had always used an antique fountain pen. This looked like a standard ballpoint. The feeling of dread escalated into certain knowledge. The document was a forgery. When she finally gathered the courage to accuse Daniel, to whisper the word fraud, the entire family unit turned cold. The lawyer quickly closed his briefcase. Don't embarrass yourself, Evelyn, her mother hissed, finally looking up, her elegance fractured by fear. We must protect the name. You have $2 million. That is generous. By the end of the month, the dismissal was complete. Evelyn was formally escorted from the property by new, unfamiliar security guards. Her name, her inheritance, and every last shred of her dignity had been stolen by blood. She left with only what she had arrived with: the old pickup, a few boxes of clothes, and her father's heavy, reliable gold watch, which he had gifted her on her 18th birthday. It was the only thing she truly possessed. Evelyn moved to the distant edge of the city, renting a one-room apartment with stained carpets that smelled faintly of old coffee and defeat. She had $2 million, inaccessible until her 30th birthday, 3 years away. For now, she had the few $1,000s she had saved from her volunteer work. The tabloids had a field day, transforming her private tragedy into public sport. Ross heiress, disinherited, brother takes full control, and Arthur's black sheep, Evelyn chooses hippie life over holdings. She didn't mourn the money, she mourned the betrayal. She tried to start over. She worked menial jobs, waiting tables, managing inventory in a dusty archive, while studying finance, corporate law, and forensic accounting at night, enrolling in online courses under an assumed name, Evelyn. She learned how money truly flowed, how power moved unseen, and how deep the corruption ran beneath the glossy veneer of the global economy. In the silence of her lonely apartment, she replayed that last family dinner again and again. It was 2 weeks before his first heart attack. Her father had pulled her aside after Daniel had finished an arrogant monologue about a new offshore shell company. Arthur's final words to her, whispered low over the untouched lemon tart, were the only things that kept the darkness at bay. If anything happens to me, Evie, trust the lockbox. Only trust the lockbox. The memory haunted her, a riddle wrapped in a final, frantic warning. But she never knew what it meant, where it was, or what it contained, until the night 3 years later, when everything changed. Building the armor. Evelyn didn't just study. She forged herself into something new. She was no longer the soft, idealistic girl. Her idealism was now edged with iron discipline and focused venom. Her most crucial connection came during a night class on international finance. She met Dr. Elias Vance, a disgraced, brilliant former corporate auditor who had been pushed out of a major bank after attempting to report a massive fraud scheme. Vance saw the cold, determined fire in Evelyn's eyes. He became her mentor, her shadow guru. He taught her how to navigate the dark web of corporate crime, how to track money through layered shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and how to use data science to spot the subtle signatures of fraud that human accountants missed. "You don't fight a tiger with a feather, Evelyn," Vance once told her, sketching out a complex financial flowchart on a whiteboard. "You fight it with a bigger cage, constructed by rules they themselves broke." Using the $3 million trust fund that finally vested on her 30th birthday and combining it with Vance's institutional knowledge, Evelyn launched her own company, EVE Corp. Eve Corp was a quiet, bespoke data security and forensic firm that specialized in digital asset recovery and corporate intelligence. They didn't just find fraud. They meticulously built legal and technological cases designed to make corrupt organizations collapse under their own weight. Her name was forgotten. Her influence, however, was about to become seismic. She had traded her identity for power. For 5 years, EVE Corp grew in the shadows, taking down minor criminals, refining their methodologies, and building an untouchable reputation within a very specific, dark corner of the financial world. Every successful takedown was practice for Daniel. Every victory was a sharpening of the claw. She lived like a ghost, completely isolated, her only connection to her past, a daily check on Ross Holdings' publicly traded stock price. A grim measure of Daniel's continued success and her deepening hatred. 3 years into Eve Corp's operation, 7 years after her father's death, Evelyn received a package. It was a simple brown cardboard box, postmarked from Geneva, Switzerland. There was no return address. Inside, resting on a bed of tissue paper, was a single heavy brass key, deeply tarnished and clearly antique. Beside it lay a small, folded note, written in her father's familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. The loops and dips instantly recognizable. The note read, "Truth waits beneath the ash tree. It is locked, but yours." Her breath caught, searing in her throat. The ash tree, the immense gnarled tree her father had planted on her 10th birthday, standing sentinel in the rear corner of the Ross Estate Gardens. A secret place, visible only from the window of his private study. The shock was so profound she couldn't move for 10 minutes. Her father hadn't forgotten. He had engineered a final, delayed message. She knew the risk was astronomical. She knew Daniel had guards, cameras, and paranoia to spare, but the promise of truth was a force she could not deny. End. She planned the infiltration for 2 weeks using EVE Corp's resources. She purchased schematics of the estate, hacked into the local security patrol schedules, and used Vance's old contacts to confirm Daniel was away in Asia, finalizing a deal. On a moonless Tuesday night, Evelyn drove her unmarked, heavily modified EVE Corp surveillance van to the periphery of the Ross estate. Dressed in full tactical black, a uniform of vengeance, she slipped through a weak point in the northern perimeter fence. The grounds were silent, illuminated only by the distant floodlights that cast long, confusing shadows. She moved like a phantom across the manicured lawns, the grass unnervingly soft beneath her boots. She reached the sprawling garden and, using the memory of a child's game, found the massive, winding root structure of the ash tree. She worked quickly, silently, the cold, damp earth yielding slowly to her compact, military-grade shovel. She dug precisely where she and her father used to sit, the spot Arthur had sworn was exactly in the center of the roots. Clang! The shovel hit metal. It was a lockbox, rusted, heavy, a rectangle of cold, unyielding iron. She used the brass key. It turned with a satisfying, agonizingly slow click, a sound that felt like 7 years of silent suffering being released. She didn't dare open it in the garden. She retreated swiftly, leaving the earth undisturbed, and drove back to her office, the lockbox secured in a specialized Faraday cage in the back of the van. Inside Eve Corp's secure, subterranean war room, she placed the box on the stainless steel table. The contents were neatly organized: ledgers and contracts, detailed handwritten notes from Arthur, outlining every asset, every bank account, and the true ethical business plan for Ross Holdings. The USB drive, labeled simply "The Record," the original will, a thick legal parchment bearing her father's undeniable signature, witnessed by 2 members of his personal staff, dated 2 months before his death. Evelyn was the sole heir, tasked with dissolving the corrupt side of the company and dedicating its assets to a nonprofit housing and education foundation. Daniel was specifically left only a stipend, with a note citing his preoccupation with personal gain over moral stewardship. Evelyn stared at the pages, tears finally blurring her vision. He hadn't abandoned her. He had protected her, knowing she was the only one who wouldn't be corrupted by the money. She plugged in the USB drive. The files were encrypted with a complex key, but Vance had already anticipated this. Within 30 minutes, the files opened. Her blood ran cold, freezing in her veins. The final file wasn't about the will. It was a collection of medical reports, pharmacy logs, and a series of cryptic emails between Daniel and a pharmaceutical supplier in Macau. Her father's final medical reports were side by side with Daniel's imported goods manifest. The truth stared back at her with chilling clarity. Arthur's specialized, life-saving heart medication had been replaced with counterfeit pills, ones Daniel had secretly ordered and swapped into the safe in the study. Her father's death hadn't been a natural, fatal heart attack. It was engineered. It was murder. Evelyn sank to her knees, the floor concrete and hard beneath her. The truth was poison, a crushing weight of grief and horror, but it burned clean, incinerating the last vestiges of the naive girl. Daniel hadn't just stolen her life, he had taken her father's. She knew exactly what to do with it. Justice wouldn't be served by a simple press conference. It required a spectacular, humiliating collapse engineered by her own hand. Evelyn reinvented herself completely, shedding her former life and fully inhabiting the persona of Evelyn, CEO of Eve Corp. Her goal shifted from mere justice to total, irreparable annihilation. For the next 2 years, she built power in plain sight, but under the shield of anonymity. She hired the best: lawyers, forensic accountants, and cyber specialists who had no idea of her true identity or her ultimate target. She focused on accumulating capital, strategic partnerships, and, most importantly, impeccable legitimacy. Then, Daniel Ross announced his latest, most ambitious project: a $500 million merger with the global investor Kane and Vale Group. It was a consolidation of power that would make Ross Holdings untouchable. Evelyn saw her window. A high-profile event, a captured audience of global finance, the perfect stage for an execution. The pre-merger gala was held in the Ross Estate Ballroom, the same room where she'd been forced to smile politely as a child, and the same room that had witnessed the funeral reception. Evelyn arrived in a custom-made midnight blue silk gown, her hair tied sleekly back, every line of her posture speaking of calculated power. Her face, hardened by years of calculation and stress, was virtually unfamiliar. She watched from the periphery as her mother, Margaret, paused near the entrance, her eyes sweeping the crowd with habitual, judgmental scrutiny. Margaret's gaze passed right over Evelyn without a flicker of recognition, seeing only a powerful woman, not her own daughter. Daniel was center stage, holding a glass of aged scotch, basking in the adoration of his board members. He raised his glass for a toast, his voice loud and confident. "To family," he pronounced, drawing a mocking, subtle emphasis on the word, the foundation of all great empires. Evelyn took her moment. She stepped from the shadows of the arched doorway, her voice calm, clear, and perfectly modulated to carry over the background murmur. Family, yes, always the best performance. Daniel froze, the sound of his crystal glass hitting the marble floor, a brittle, shattering sound, was the loudest noise in the ballroom. He turned slowly, his confident facade cracking under the weight of her presence. The smile dissolved into a look of sheer, panicked recognition. "Evelyn," he whispered, the name a choke of disbelief and fear. The crowd murmured. Reporters, who had been invited for puff pieces, suddenly looked alert. Cameras turned. Daniel forced a thin, dry laugh. He quickly moved to her, gripping her elbow tightly, a warning in his eyes. "You've changed, Evie. What are you doing here?" "Some wounds grow armor," she said softly, pulling her arm away. Her eyes were cold, winter in July. "Others grow claws, brother. I'm here to consult. Eve Corp has been retained to review the merger due diligence. Kane and Vale insist on triple-checking the financials before the signing." Daniel's panic momentarily faded into arrogance. He assumed she was there to reconcile, maybe to beg for a partnership or a piece of the action. He quickly shifted gears, offering her a false, predatory smile. "Always the diligent one. Good, Eve. Keep an eye on the details. Wouldn't want any surprises." In the following weeks, Evelyn became Daniel's shadow. She was officially designated the security and compliance consultant for the merger. He gave her unfettered access, believing she was protecting his interests, entirely unaware that the scorpion was already inside the jar. The work was tedious, precise, and deeply satisfying. Every file she touched, every deal she helped him close, she was collecting the final pieces of the evidence needed for a federal indictment. She found the details of a massive tax fraud scheme layered across 3 continents, utilizing the very shell companies Daniel had once boasted about at that last dinner. She traced blackmail transactions that Daniel had used to silence a major competitor years earlier. She found the exact paper trail linking his offshore holdings to millions in embezzled client funds. She didn't expose it all at once. She executed a controlled dismantling. Week 1. She anonymously leaked a minor, almost untraceable tip to a low-level financial blogger about an alleged accounting inconsistency in a small Ross Holdings subsidiary. The stock dipped 2%. Daniel cursed, dismissed it as a market fluctuation, and praised Evelyn for pointing out the minor risk. Week 2. She used Eve Corp's software to flag and freeze a small suspicious transfer of $500,000 from a Ross Holdings account to an unknown numbered bank account in Liechtenstein. She presented this to Daniel as a security flaw she had fixed. Daniel was impressed by her efficiency, completely blind to the fact that he was the target. Week 3. She initiated the process of triggering the lockbox protocol, the delivery of the complete evidence packet, the will, and the murder proof to her most trusted contacts in the Department of Justice and the FBI's Corporate Crimes Division. The arrest warrant was signed. All that was needed was the public trigger. As Daniel scrambled, dealing with the minor but increasingly frequent tremors she was initiating, Evelyn merely looked on with a clinical detachment. He was arrogant, dismissive, and entirely dependent on her expertise to fix the problems she was creating. He was trapped in his own hubris. The night of the merger signing arrived, the culmination of Daniel's empire and Evelyn's decade of vengeful work. The conference room on the 40th floor of the Ross Holdings Tower was packed. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular, indifferent view of the city. Daniel sat at the head of the immense glass table, flanked by the principals of Kane and Vale, board members, lawyers, and a swarm of high-profile financial reporters. He looked calm, powerful, invincible. Margaret Ross sat in the front row, radiating silent pride, utterly blind to the impending cataclysm. Evelyn stood directly behind Daniel, posing as his primary security consultant. She wore an earpiece, but she wasn't listening to Daniel's team. She was listening to the FBI command center, coordinating the timing of their entry. Daniel gave a short, self-aggrandizing speech about family, vision, and legacy. As he finished, signaling the start of the official signing ceremony, Evelyn nodded almost imperceptibly. Instead of the agreed-upon financial summary charts for the merger, the screen displayed the scanned, dated pages of Arthur Ross's original will. A collective gasp filled the room, immediately followed by the aggressive, synchronized clicking of dozens of camera shutters. Reporters surged forward, their faces twisted in confusion and avarice. The Kane and Vale executives looked around frantically for Daniel's head of PR. Daniel shot to his feet, knocking his expensive chair backward. "What is this? Stop the screen. Security." But the security team was Evelyn's. She'd replaced them all months ago. The projection automatically switched to the next file, the clear, dated bank manifest showing Daniel's payment to the Macau supplier, titled Counterfeit Meds Order Confirmation. Then came the audio file, a dry, digital scratch that suddenly resolved into Arthur's distinctive, weary, but resolute voice. It was a recording made in his study weeks before his death, stored in the vault, and recorded using the lockbox's integrated microphone. "If this reaches you, it means I no longer trust my son. Daniel forged my signature. He has replaced my final wishes, and, I believe, he has compromised my health in pursuit of complete control. Evelyn is the rightful heir. Protect her. She is the future of Ross Holdings, and she is the one who carries my true integrity." The voice ended. A profound, echoing silence followed. Daniel was shaking, his face a mask of primal fury. He pointed at Evelyn, his finger trembling. "This is a lie. It's fabricated. You made this, Evie. You're nothing." Evelyn, standing tall and still, stepped forward into the full glare of the camera lights, shedding the consultant mask. Her voice sliced through the chaos, cold and precise, like a scalpel. "No, brother, the lie was yours, and the blood is on your hands." The main door to the conference room burst inward. 24 men and women in dark suits flooded the room, federal agents and white-collar crime investigators. An agent held up a court order. "Daniel Ross, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, embezzlement, and first-degree murder." The evidence Evelyn had patiently, methodically collected, the original will, the authenticated audio, the financial trail, and the murder evidence, was enough to freeze all his assets, revoke his directorships globally, and indict him for crimes that would ensure he would never see freedom again. Daniel fought. He lunged at Evelyn as the agents tried to handcuff him, rage boiling over, his eyes glazed with the absolute loss of everything. "You think you've won?" he screamed, twisting in the grip of the agents. "You're just like me, Evelyn. You're just a thief, a monster of calculation. You killed me." Evelyn leaned close, forcing him to meet her gaze. The reporters documenting every agonizing millimeter of the moment. Her whisper was cold as the winter outside the window. "No, Daniel, I didn't kill you. I just finished what Father started, the legacy of integrity." The scandal consumed the global media for weeks. Ross Holdings, the titan built on old money and new fraud, collapsed into insolvency. Evelyn, revealed as the true architect and the sole heir, emerged from the wreckage, not as a vengeful sister, but as the only person with the data necessary to salvage the ethical assets of the fallen empire. She renamed the company the Arthur Ross Group, a symbolic and legal severing from Daniel's corruption. Her mother, Margaret, tried to reach out. The letters came first, tearful, frantic apologies laced with explanations of fear and ignorance. Then came the calls. Evelyn finally agreed to one meeting in a neutral location, a park bench in the city, far from the estate. Margaret looked years older, her elegance shattered, her posture that of a defeated general. "I didn't know, Evelyn, not about the murder. I thought your father really changed his mind, that he was just disappointed you weren't what he wanted." Evelyn looked at her mother, the woman who had chosen silence over truth, who had prioritized a lifestyle over her own child. "You chose silence, Mother," Evelyn said softly, her voice devoid of anger, only deep, aching sadness. "When the lawyer read that forged will, when you saw the look on my face, you knew it was wrong, but you chose the quiet comfort of your beautiful prison. That is a betrayal, too." Margaret wept openly, but Evelyn offered no comfort. "I can't forgive the silence, Mother. It permitted the corruption, and it enabled the murder. You chose Daniel's security over my father's life and my future. That choice is permanent." Evelyn left her there, alone on the park bench, and never spoke to her again. Daniel was sentenced to life for corporate fraud, murder, and obstruction of justice. He sent letters from prison, twisted, bitter apologies mixed with threats and self-pity. But Evelyn never opened them. She burned the envelopes, unread, in a steel container in her office. Instead of dwelling on the destruction, she focused on restoration. She began the long, grueling process of liquidating the fraudulent assets and rebuilding the legitimate ones. She dissolved the opaque real estate ventures and directed the funds toward the Arthur Ross Foundation, fulfilling her father's true intent. The foundation focused on fair housing, transparent development, and technical education, a legacy built on fairness, not fraud. She traded the gold-plated, high-risk world of global speculation for the slow, ethical growth of real community development. The Ross Mansion, the kingdom of white columns, stood empty. Evelyn placed a historical marker on the gate, explaining its significance not as a sign of success, but as a monument to what unchecked greed destroys. She never lived there. Years later, Evelyn stood alone in the city, far from the silent kingdom of the Ross estate. She was no longer Evelyn, the shadowy CEO, nor was she the naive girl who wanted to save the world with a clipboard. She was Evelyn Ross, the woman who had turned pain into purpose. She was in the cemetery, standing under a young ash tree she had planted near her father's headstone, a tree that was now beginning to mature, its branches robust and hopeful. Wind rustled the branches above, carrying whispers of memory, not of betrayal, but of her father's laugh. Her reflection shimmered in the polished granite of the headstone, a face marked by struggle, but defined by victory. She took her father's old gold watch, the only thing Daniel had never been able to take from her, and placed it carefully on the flat surface of the stone. "Justice took time, Father," she whispered, her voice finally clear, no longer cracked by emotion. But it came home. The house couldn't eat itself, not entirely. I salvaged the foundation. She turned to leave. Behind her, the ghosts of greed were finally at rest, replaced by the steady, quiet work of a legacy honorably rebuilt. Moral lesson of my story is: the people who betray you the deepest are often the ones who share your blood. But blood doesn't define loyalty, actions do. Justice isn't about vengeance, it's about restoration. Sometimes the only way to truly honor family is to destroy the corruption it built.